Entertainment, movies would gradually be made more explicit as regards sex and language. After all, sex and rough language are real, and why pretend that they are not? There would be pornographic movies in the theaters, on television, and VCRs were not around at that time, but it indicated that these cassettes would be available, and video cassette players would be available for use in the home, and pornographic movies would be available on these VCRs as well as in the neighborhood theater and on your television. It said something like you'll see people in the movies doing everything you can think of. Went on to say that, and all of this is to bring sex out in the open. That was another comment that was made several times, a term, sex out in the open. Violence would be made more graphic. This was intended to desensitize people to violence. There might need to be a time when people would witness real violence and be a part of it. Later on, it'll become clear where this is headed. So there would be more realistic violence in entertainment, would make it easier for people to adjust. People's attitudes towards death would change, and they would not be so fearful of it, but more accepting of it. And not be so aghast at the sight of dead people or injured people. We don't need to have a genteel population paralyzed by what they might see. People would just learn to say, well, I don't want that to happen to me. This was the first statement suggesting that the plan includes numerous human casualties which the survivors would see. This particular aspect of the presentation came back in my memory very sharply a few years later when a movie about the Lone Ranger came out, and I took my very young son to see it, and early in the movie were some very violent scenes. One, the victim's shot in the forehead, and there was sort of a splat where the bullet entered his forehead and some blood, and I remember regretting that I took my son, and remember of feeling anger toward the doctor who spoke. Not that he made the movie, but he agreed to be part of this movement, and I was repelled by the movie, and it brought back this aspect of his presentation very sharply in my memory. As regards music, he made a rather straightforward statement like, music will get worse. And in 1969, the rock music was getting more and more unpleasant. It was interesting that just his word, the way he expressed it, it would get worse, acknowledging that it was already bad. Lyrics would become more openly sexual. No new sugary romantic music would be publicized like that which had been written before that time. All the old music would be brought back on certain radio stations and records for older people to hear. And older folks would have sort of their own radio stations to hear. And the younger people, their music, as it got worse and worse, would be on their stations. And he seemed to indicate that one group would not hear the other group's music. Older folks would just refuse to hear the junk that was offered to young people, and the young people would accept the junk because it was identified them as their generation and helped them feel distinct from the older generation. I remember at the time of thinking that would not last very long because even young kids wouldn't like the junk. When they got a chance to hear the older music that was prettier, they would gravitate toward it. Unfortunately, I was wrong about that. When the kids get through their teens and into their 20s, some of them improve their taste in music. But unfortunately, he was right. They get used to this junk, and that's all they want. A lot of them can't stand really pretty music. He went on to say the music would carry a message to the young, and nobody would even know the message was there. They just think it was loud music. At the time, I didn't understand quite what he meant by that, but in retrospect, I think we know what the messages are in the music for the young. And again, he was right. This aspect was sort of summarized with a notion that entertainment would be a tool to influence young people, won't change the older people. They're already set in their ways. But the changes would be all aimed at the young who are in their formative years, and the older generation would be passing. Not only could you not change them, but they're relatively unimportant anyhow. Once they live out their lives and are gone, the younger generation being formed are the ones that would be important for the future in the 21st century. He also indicated all the old movies would be brought back again, and I remember on hearing that, through my mind ran quickly the memories of a number of old movies that I wondered if they would be included, the ones that I thought I would like to see again. Along with bringing back old music and old movies for older people, there were other privileges that also would be accorded older folks. Free transportation, breaks on purchases, discounts, tax discounts, a number of privileges just because they were older. And this was stated to be sort of a reward for the generation which had grown up through the Depression and had survived the rigors of World War II. They had deserved it, and they were going to be rewarded with all these goodies. And the bringing back of the good old music and the good old movies was going to help ease them through their final years in comfort. Then the presentation began to get rather grim, because once that generation passed, and that would be in the late 80s and the early 90s, where we are now, most of that group would be gone. And then gradually things would tighten up, and the tightening up would be accelerated. The old movies and old songs would be withdrawn. The gentler entertainment would be withdrawn. Travel, instead of being easy for old folks, travel then would become very restricted. People would need permission to travel, and they would need a good reason to travel. If you didn't have a good reason for your travel, you would not be allowed to travel. And everyone would need ID. This would at first be an ID card you would carry on your person, and you must show when you're asked for it. It was already planned that later on some sort of device would be developed to be implanted under the skin that would be coded specifically to identify the individual. This would eliminate the possibility of false ID, and also eliminate the possibility of people saying, well, I lost my ID. The difficulty about the skin implanted ID was stated to be getting a material that would stay in or under the skin without causing a foreign body reaction, whereby the body would reject it or cause infection, and that this would have to be material on which information could be recorded and retrieved by some sort of scanner while it was not rejected by the body. Silicone was mentioned. Silicone at that time was thought to be well tolerated. It was used to augment breasts. Women who felt their breasts were too small would get silicone implants. I guess that still goes on. In any event, silicone was seen at that time as the promising material to do both, to be retained in the body without rejection and to be able to retain information retrievable by electronic means. Food. Food supply would come under tight control. If population growth didn't slow down, food shortages could be created in a hurry, and people would realize the dangers of overpopulation. Ultimately, whether the population slows down or not, though, the food supply is to be brought under centralized control so that people would have enough to be well nourished, but they would not have enough to support any fugitive from the new system. In other words, if you had a friend or relative who didn't sign on, and growing one's own food would be outlawed. This would be done under some sort of pretext. in the beginning I mentioned there were two purposes for everything. One, the ostensible purpose, and two, the real purpose. And an ostensible purpose here would be that growing your own vegetables was unsafe, it would spread disease or something like that. So the acceptable idea was to protect the consumer, but the real idea is to limit the food supply, and growing your own food would be illegal. And if you persist in illegal activities like growing food, then you're a criminal. There was a mention then of weather, W-E-A-T-H-E-R. This was another really striking statement. He said, we can, or soon will be able to control the weather. He said, I'm not merely referring to dropping iodide crystals into clouds to precipitate rain that's already there, but real control. And weather was seen as a weapon of war, a weapon of influencing public policy. You could make rain or withhold rain in order to influence certain areas and bring them under your control. There were two sides to this that were kind of striking. He said, on the one hand, you can make drought during the growing season so that nothing will grow, and on the other hand, you can make for very heavy rains during the harvest seasons so that the fields are too muddy to bring in the harvest, and indeed one might be able to do both. There was no statement how this would be done. It was stated that it was either already possible or very, very close to being possible. Politics. He said, very few people know how government really works. Something to the effect that elected officials are influenced in ways that they don't even realize. And they carry out plans that have been made for them, and they think they are that they are authors of the plans. But actually they've been are manipulated in ways that they don't understand. Somewhere in the presentation he made two statements that I want to insert at this time. I don't remember just where they were made, but they're valid as in terms of the general overall view. The one statement, people can carry in their minds and act upon two contradictory ideas at the same time, provided these two contradictory ideas are kept far enough apart. And the other one, the other statement is, you can know pretty well how rational people are going to respond to certain circumstances or to certain information that they encounter. So to determine the response you want, you need only control the kind of data or information that they are presented or the kinds of circumstances they're in. And being rational people, they'll do what you want them to do. They may not fully understand what they're doing or why. Somewhere in this connection then was a statement admitting that some scientific research data could be, and indeed has been, falsified in order to bring about desired results. And here it was said, people don't ask the right questions. Some people are too trusting. Now, this was an interesting statement because the speaker and the audience, all being doctors of medicine and supposedly very objectively, dispassionately scientific, and science being the be-all and end-all, well, to falsify data, scientific research data, in that setting is like blasphemy in the church. You just don't do that. Anyhow, out of all of this was to, on the political scene, was to come the new international governing body, probably to come through the UN and with the World Court, but not necessarily through those structures. It could be brought about in other ways. Acceptance of the UN at that time was seen as not being as wide as had been hoped. Efforts would continue to give the United Nations increasing importance. People would be more and more used to the idea of relinquishing some national sovereignty. Economic interdependence would foster this goal from a peaceful standpoint. Avoidance of war would foster it from the standpoint of worrying about hostilities. It was recognized that doing it peaceably was better than doing it by war. It was stated at this point that war is obsolete. And I thought that was an interesting phrase because obsolete means something that once was seen as useful is no longer useful. But war is obsolete, this being because of the nuclear bombs. War is no longer controllable. Formerly, wars could be controlled, but if nuclear weapons would fall into the wrong hands, there could be an unintended nuclear disaster. It was not stated who the wrong hands are. We were free to infer that maybe this meant terrorists, but in more recent years I'm wondering whether the wrong hands might also include people that we've assumed have had nuclear weapons all along. Maybe they don't have them. Just as it was stated that industry would be preserved in the United States a little bit, just in case the worldwide plans didn't work out, just in case some country or some other powerful person decided to bolt from the pack and go his own way. One wonders whether this might also be true with nuclear weapons. When you hear that he said they might fall into the wrong hands, there was some statement that the possession of nuclear weapons has been tightly controlled, sort of implying that anybody who had nuclear weapons was intended to have them. That would necessarily have included the Soviet Union, if indeed they have them. But I recall at the time of wondering, are you telling us or are you implying that that this country willingly gave nuclear weapons to the Soviets? At that time, that seemed like a terribly unthinkable thing to do, much less to admit. The leaders of the Soviet Union seemed to be so dependent on the West, though. One wonders whether there might have been some fear that they would try to assert independence if they indeed had these weapons. So, I don't know. It's something to speculate about, perhaps. Who did he mean when he said if these weapons fall into the wrong hands? Maybe just terrorists. We'll see. Anyhow, the new system would be brought in, if not by peaceful cooperation, everybody willingly yielding national sovereignty, then by bringing the nation to the brink of nuclear war. And everybody would be so fearful, as hysteria was created about the possibility of nuclear war, that there would be a strong public outcry to negotiate a peace, and people would willingly give up national sovereignty in order to achieve peace, and thereby this would bring in the new international political system. This was stated, and a very impressive thing to hear then. If there were too many people in the right places who resisted this, there might be a need to use one or two, possibly more nuclear weapons. As it was put, this would be possibly needed to convince people that we mean business. And that was followed with a statement that by the time one or two of those went off, then everybody, even the most reluctant, would yield. He said something about this negotiated peace would be very convincing. This kind of in a framework or in a context that the whole thing was rehearsed, but nobody would know it. People hearing about it would be convinced that it was a genuine negotiation between hostile enemies who finally had come to the realization that peace was better than war. In this context, discussing war and war is obsolete, a statement was made that there were some good things about war. One, you're going to die anyway, and people sometimes in war get a chance to display great courage and heroism, and if they die, they've died well, and if they survive, they get recognition. So that in any case, the hardships of war on the soldiers are worth it because that's the reward they get out of their warring. Another justification for war expressed was if you think of the many millions of casualties in World War I and World War II, well, suppose all those people had not died but continued to live and continued to have babies. There would be millions upon millions, and we would already be overpopulated. So those two great wars served a benign purpose in delaying overpopulation. But now there are technological means for the individual and governments to control overpopulation. So in this regard, war is obsolete. It's no longer needed. And then it's obsolete because nuclear weapons could destroy the whole universe. War which once was controllable could get out of control. And so for these two reasons, it's now obsolete.